So now we are moving on to our guest speakers. First up, we have Ian Titherington from Cardiff City Council, talking around adapting ideas and designs to meet the new legislation. So Ian, if you can hear me, hopefully you're there and ready to share. You've shared already. Over to you, my friend.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all see the screen? Yeah?
Yeah, we can see that, definitely.
Yep. Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, it's a bit wordy, so apologies. I'll try and flick through as quickly as I can so we can get some questions at the end. Just to explain, I'm drainage engineer in Cardiff Council. I'm now also a SAB officer, Set Approval Board officer, so all applications that trigger SAB legislation in Wales in Cardiff come through me or one or two other colleagues. Because I've got a drainage background, I tend to take on the bigger projects. Here we are. I think I've just jumped 1 or 2 pages. Flood and Water Management Act 2010, Schedule 3. As of January 7th last year, we've all been pretty busy in Wales in local authorities. 25 SABs, all councils and 3 national parks. Many are already aware of this. It is a steep learning curve, I think, is a way of phrasing it. Again, legislative conditions based on the 4 pillars of such design about reducing flooding, improving quality, delivering amenity, delivering biodiversity, and also ensuring that there's maintenance, ownership, and adoption of the actual facilities. Probably one of the more challenging elements of what we're trying to deal with. Implementation of Schedule 3, as you say, it started last year. Started very quietly, actually. Very few applications in the first 6 months. It's busier now than it was at that time. I think a lot of people were unsure about how the legislation worked, how it would be delivered in each local authority. Very much like planning authorities, there's different interpretation of the legislation. So you probably won't find 2 local authorities doing the same thing. What I'll be talking today is about how we're approaching the legislation in Cardiff. It might vary from some other local authorities, but we try and be consistent with the legislation and also try to be reasonable with each application. What is a SAB? Set Approval Body. Basically, it's about 5 of us in Cardiff working in drainage, design and in implementation, and any application over 100 square metres where the runoff characteristics have changed within a construction site triggers SAB. It might not be from soft to hard engineering, it's just how the surface water runoff changes, and it has to be over 100 square metres. There are a few exceptions, not many. Trunk roads, network rail, some agricultural buildings. Outside that, it catches SAB. The 6 standards were previously mentioned, based on 12 principles. Looking at all these, from my perspective, the most important thing is, have you got an outlet, and what's the difference in level between the inlet of your outlet and your finished ground level? That depth, that hydraulic depth, is where all magic happens. Where the cleansing goes, where the attenuation goes. The bigger that depth, the more you've got to play with. And the simple rule of thumb is, the longer you keep it on the surface, the cheaper it is. The more you go into ground, particularly on a brownfield site, the more expensive it gets. The one bit of advice we always give to people is get in early, because that's when it's easier and cheaper and quicker to do a design. One I got crossed out here, it is in the legislation. Rainwater harvesting tanks. If you've got a low rate and you're working 7 days a week, go for it. Otherwise, in Cardiff, we don't insist on these, because in reality, you probably won't even make the money back in a year for the maintenance it costs to run one of these things. There isn't a massive rainwater shortage in the area, so maybe that's less of a priority for us. But at the moment, we can't allow rainwater harvesting tanks to be included as part of attenuation. We have to assume it's full when it rains. So it's a nice thing for BREEAM standards, but unless you have a lot of brown water, grey water use, we don't insist on it. And we certainly wouldn't include it as part of any attenuation figures. Then infiltration, discharge to surface water body, discharge to surface water sewer or highway drain. Final one, discharge to combined sewer. Infiltration in Cardiff, difficult. Surface water runoff hydraulic console. Basically, all the people finding the standards. Critical areas. The first one in 1 year return period, or 5, equivalent to 5 mil. What we're doing there is holding the pollutants. That's a very important element. Sometimes difficult in designs on tight sites is to hold those pollutants before there's any overflow. That's an important element. 1 in 100 year plus 40% for climate change. That's all about exacerbation of flood risk. In certain instances, I wouldn't insist on that in the SAB officer because the definition is, does it exacerbate flood risk? If, for instance, it went into a water area where there was controlled water, such as the River Taff or into Cardiff Bay, I might consider a lower standard because there's no flood risk downstream. So again, that's how approaching Cardiff is about being flexible, consistent on the standards, but flexible with each individual site, because it's very, very important. I can't overemphasize this. A SAB does its job properly, then you get a better design. Don't think about it, it's going to delay things, it can cost more money. Generally, it speeds things up because there's no drainage conditions in planning. It makes things quicker. And if you get enough on a pre-application, more often than not, it's a little cheaper as well. So there's an urban myth about SUDs that it takes longer and costs more, only if you get your design wrong. You know, it's really, really important to get in them with us early and don't fit the design before you come to us, because that's when it all goes wrong. That's when you start retrofitting with SUDs. That's when it gets expensive. Hydraulic control, nature development, greenfield or brownfield. There is a bit of a let off of a brownfield site. If you've got a brownfield site where the drainage is still working effectively and it's going to the same outlet, we would consider a 30% improvement on that runoff rather than a really, really tight controlled runoff. That is something in the legislation that gives flexibility on brownfield sites. It's not all that common, to be honest, because usually the systems are defunct. So therefore, we consider it as a greenfield site. But it can occasionally happen. And if it does, we'll help developers with that. A controlling the rate and volume. Often we look at Q-bar. We are starting to reduce the flows going into combined systems now to less than 5 litres a second. We used to have a minimum of 5 in Cardiff. We go down to 2 or 3 now, if it's the only option. The reason being, it's very unlikely to block if you've got an office plate that's been filtered through a SUD system. The likelihood of block and maintenance, the blockage is far reduced. So we are happy to reduce the flow going into the system, knowing that the reality is unlikely to get blocked. So that's why we've reduced and something the Water Authority are happy with. Exceedance flows are really important. If that system overflows, where's the water going? We had floods in Cardiff recently in a housing estate built after the war. The water went straight through 20, 30 houses. It was surface water flooding, no water courses, no rivers, straight rainfall. No systems failed. The reality was they weren't designed for climate change. And that's a problem across the whole of Wales. And we're going to be using SUDs in the next couple of years to try and protect those houses. So where the exceedance flow goes is very, very important. Water quality. This is something that's changed in terms of legislation. The SUDS manual simple index is what we use in terms of simple scoring for what systems you can use in terms of treatment. It's all about highway runoff. 95% pollution off any site is highway. Roof pollution is easy to deal with. Footpath pollution is easy to deal with. All the pollutants, hydrocarbons, suspended solids, metals, they're all off the highway. How you deal with that and how you maintain dealing with that is really, really important. That's always the area I look for in terms of quality. This is what I mentioned earlier, the simple index, the scoring. You can find in the SUDS manual. We recommend this with everyone and everyone uses it. It's a very simple, easy to understand method of actually managing quality. Gullies are scored 0 here. Kind of agree and disagree with Sustrain on that. Don't tell Paul Schaffer I said. But you can use gullies as part of a SUD system. So if you had a gully as a silt trap before going into a rain garden, then going into a subsurface box such as permavite, etc., we'd be happy with that, because what that would do is hold the heavy solids before it goes into the rain garden. Reduces your maintenance costs. Have a standard highway gully design, so highways department are happy to clean them out. That's where you would use gullies as part of a SUD system, where they are very useful. It's about keeping the maintenance low. If the maintenance is high, it won't be maintained. And if we have a SUDS application, SAB application where maintenance is high, I won't pass it. I won't let them build it because I know it won't be maintained. Amenity. Very broad definition on amenity. I was telling a colleague yesterday we had a SAB application for a new blast furnace and a steelworks, so you get all sorts. And I did toy with the idea of putting in a rain garden next to the blast furnace. You could have a look when it's working, but I thought probably not. So what we did there, we looked at the overall sites that the applicant owned, and we looked at work we could do away from the application where the construction was going to take place. So it was almost like offset SUDs. So we found out where they sat down and had their lunch away from the blast furnace, created an amenity area there with biodiversity. That's how we were enabled to give SAB approval, and I think we met all the 6 standards. You know, you've got to be reasonable and realistic with what each site can offer. Sometimes it might be offset, but it's got to relate to the sites in question. Biodiversity, again, this is an area that I'm still learning as an engineer. You have to look at what's there before and what's there after, and it has to be enhanced biodiversity in terms of before and after. That could be trees, but often simple things like reseeding pollinators. You know, a grass bank is monoculture. It doesn't offer a lot. If you put much more biodiverse mix of seeds, you can offer a lot more for not a lot of money. You know, and when you're looking at reseeding pollinators, you're looking at really rubbish soil with lots of stones in it. And because maintenance, again, is very, very little. It's something councils are learning at the moment in terms of road verges. So certainly biodiversity is an expanding area, but it doesn't have to be expensive. And combine it with the quality, combine it with the amenity. If you put them all together, you means you're going to keep your development density and meet the 6 standards. If you do them separately, you're wasting space. You know, and I will help developers sometimes to combine those so they can have a more successful development, because you're meeting the standards and it's about better design. Design for construction, operation and maintenance. This is work in progress, I think is how I best describe it. Generally, we have a mandatory obligation to adopt in certain circumstances as a SAB. Often what we find is there'll be a single curtilage, a private developer will take on the maintenance personally, and we'd agree the maintenance schedule and read the design. We could adopt, and we are looking at commuted sums in those situations. For small developments, that can be challenging. For larger developments, often we look at the options for private management companies. Again, that's politically challenging for many local authorities. So that's something we're going through as an authority in a moment, and I know different authorities have different approaches. But the most important thing of all is to get design right, to make sure that maintenance is minimised. That's very, very important. As to flick through quickly, the 6 standards again. Duty to adopt, as I mentioned earlier, we are considering non-conformance bonds, because if everything goes wrong as a SAB, we may have to pick up the bill. We can't afford that. We have to make sure we're covered as a SAB on behalf of the local authority. Inspection fees, we will be charging. We will be inspecting when installations take place, and we will be inspecting after as well. That's our role and responsibility. Something that doesn't happen at the moment prior to SAB, and it's always been a concern for us from the drainage section. Community sums management companies, that can vary between local authorities, and I think it's good to have the flexibility there, because I think it offers the options. It's a political issue for many local authorities, and I think the flexibility is important. Enforcement. SUS legislation is completely separate from planning, but they run in parallel. We have the same powers, and in many ways it's probably more Puritan than the planning legislation, because if there was an appeal against a SUS decision or a SAB decision, it would go to the planning authority, who probably wouldn't have any understanding of the legislation in the first place. So that's why we've got to be careful as a SAB in terms of any decisions we make. I think we've got to be seen to be reasonable to try and avoid these situations. But at the end of the day, we do have powers to enforce, up to the ultimate of turning it back to the original site conditions, which we don't want to do, but we can and will if we have to. If some applicants completely ignore what we say and completely ignore the statutory legislation, we will act on it in Cardiff, because we have to, because we're the capital city and we've got a responsibility. So hopefully you never get to that situation, because no one wins in that situation. What does it mean for developers? Please come through the door early as a pre-app. For the first 12 months, we didn't charge for pre-apps because there was so little response from people. We wanted to bring them through the door. People were very nervous about the legislation. So what we did is, for the first 12 months, we did charge. We do charge now, but it's not a huge amount of money, because what you get out of a pre-application is clarification of viability for that site. We'll give a fairly quick response on whether that site's viable and what concerns you've got. And then what I generally do is have a few more conversations after that pre-app meeting, prior to them putting the SAB application in, to be sure there are absolutely no problems, and any tweaks we have to make would be minor and wouldn't affect the SAB application. But the most important thing is to get in early. Don't come to me with a fixed design that's already gone into planning. That's an absolute nightmare, because I have to come in with a retrofit design, and there's a really good chance it won't pass SAB and it won't get built, and it'll have to go to planning again under a new application. I really want to avoid that. It does happen, unfortunately, but hopefully less and less as the more people understand what the legislation means in Wales. Right, SAB process, get in early, concept engagement, pre-application, then the application, discharge conditions. Well, there won't be really any conditions other than for operation and maintenance. The only other thing might be flood consequences assessment with NRW. If it's outside the remit of NRW and there are no worries about that, then basically once you've got SAB approval, you can crack on. There are no drainage conditions included, hopefully, in the planning process, which does mean it should be faster. And that's a really, really important element that I know that developers want and clients want. What will SABs deliver? Early engagement, multi-benefits in terms of a site. I think you get better design and better places to live. It's as simple as that. If you get in early, I can more or less guarantee you'll be faster, hopefully cheaper, and you'll have a better design. Don't be scared by the stories that SUDS is expensive and it delays. That only happens when you don't take drainage at the start of a development and you take it at the end. Treat surface water like gas, electricity, tap water, treat it as a statutory service. It's the hardest one to deliver because Mother Nature decides where and when it falls. But more often than not, it's done at the end instead of the beginning. This legislation is all about doing surface water at the beginning rather than at the end of the development. It's as simple as that, and don't make it more complicated than it is. It just makes lives easier and leads to better design. A final mention, we will be publishing a guide in Cardiff. We keep amending it all the time as we're learning, particularly for small developments where it's difficult to employ an architect and a designer to turn over a small development because the architects might not necessarily have the background to understand the legislation. We will be publishing it soon to try and help particularly small developers and give more consistency as to how Cardiff approaches the legislation. That's it.
Thanks, Ian. Really good presentation. For me to kind of coin a phrase from the current serious SUDS champion, like when you spoke around the longer you keep rainwater on or close to the surface, the more cost effective it is, then how you're going to utilise SUDS to kind of protect houses in the next few years. Really key messages for me there.